Maria Santos wiped the flour from her hands as she looked out the window of her small bakery. The morning sun cast long shadows across the narrow street in the heart of São Paulo's old district. At 62, she had been running this bakery for almost 30 years, serving the local community with fresh bread and pastries that reminded people of their grandmother's cooking. The bakery was modest, squeezed between a barber shop and a small grocery store. The faded sign above the door read, Padaria Santos, in weathered blue letters. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves holding loaves of bread, sweet rolls, and traditional Brazilian treats. The smell of fresh baking filled the air every morning. Before dawn, when Maria arrived to begin her daily routine, Maria lived alone in a small apartment above the bakery. Her husband had passed away 8 years ago, and her children had moved to other cities for work. The bakery was her life, her purpose, and her connection to the community she had served for decades. She knew every regular customer by name and remembered their preferences, their family stories, and their struggles. This particular morning felt different somehow. There had been increasing tension in the neighborhood over the past few weeks. Political protests had been growing throughout the city. The government had responded by increasing military presence in various districts. Maria had seen more. Soldiers and police officers patrolling the streets, their faces stern and watchful. The protests were about economic inequality and government corruption, issues that affected everyone in Maria's neighborhood. Most of her customers were working-class families who struggled to make ends meet. They came to her bakery not just for bread, but for a sense of community and normalcy in increasingly difficult times. Around 9 in the morning, Maria noticed a young soldier standing across the street from her bakery. He couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with short dark hair and a uniform that looked too big for his slight frame. He had been posted there as part of the increased security measures, but something about his demeanor caught Maria's attention. The soldier stood rigidly at attention, but Maria could see that he kept glancing toward her bakery. His face showed the strain of someone who had been standing in the same position for hours. More concerning to Maria was how thin he looked, as if he hadn't been eating properly for days. As the morning progressed, Maria watched the young soldier from her window while she worked. Customers came and went, buying their daily bread and chatting about neighborhood news. Several people mentioned the increased military presence, some with concern, others with approval. Maria listened to their conversations while keeping an eye on the soldier across the street. Around 11 o'clock, Adia noticed that the soldier was swaying slightly on his feet. The morning sun had grown stronger, and the temperature was rising. He had been standing in the same spot for over 2 hours without relief, and it was clear that he was struggling with the heat and exhaustion. Maria's maternal instincts kicked in as she watched the young man. He reminded her of her own son at that age, serious and trying to appear strong, while still being just a boy in many ways. She could see that he was fighting to maintain his composure and fulfill his duties, but his physical discomfort was obvious. The soldier's situation troubled Maria deeply. Regardless of the political tensions in the city, she saw a young person who was suffering. Her years of experience as a mother and community member had taught her to recognize when someone needed help, and this soldier clearly needed assistance. As lunchtime approached, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She selected one of her best loaves of fresh bread, still warm from the oven, and wrapped it carefully in clean paper. She also filled a small bottle with cold water from her refrigerator. Her plan was simple. She would offer food and water to the young soldier. Maria understood that approaching a military guard while tensions were high might be risky. She had no idea how he might react or whether his superiors would approve of such interaction with civilians. However, her compassion overrode her caution. She had spent her entire adult life feeding people. She could not stand by and watch someone go hungry. Before leaving her bakery, Maria said a small prayer for protection and wisdom. She asked for the right words to say and for the soldier to understand that her intentions were purely kind. She had no political agenda, no hidden motives, just a desire to help another human being who appeared to be in need. Maria stepped out of her bakery and walked slowly across the street toward the young soldier. As she approached, she could see him tense up, unsure of what this elderly woman wanted from him. His training had probably warned him about civilians who might approach with hostile intentions. But Maria's gentle demeanor and the obvious offering in her hands seemed to confuse rather than alarm him. When Maria reached the soldier, she looked up at his young face and saw exhaustion, hunger, and perhaps homesickness in his eyes. She spoke softly in Portuguese, introducing herself and explaining that she had noticed he had been standing there for hours without food or water. She offered him the bread and water, emphasizing that she simply wanted to help. The soldier's reaction was immediate and emotional. For a moment, his military composure cracked, and Maria could see the grateful young man beneath the uniform. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at the simple offering of bread and water. He tried to maintain his professional demeanor, but his gratitude was unmistakable. However, the soldier explained that he could not accept the food while on duty. Military regulations prohibited him from eating or drinking while on guard duty. He could face serious consequences if his superiors discovered that he had broken protocol. Despite his obvious hunger and thirst, he felt obligated to refuse Maria's generous offer. Maria understood his dilemma, but she was not ready to give up. She told the soldier that she would leave the bread and water nearby, perhaps on the steps of her bakery, where he could retrieve them later if he chose to do so. She made it clear that there were no expectations or conditions attached to her offer, just one human being trying to help another. The young soldier, whose name was Carlos Mendoza, watched Maria return to her bakery with the bread and water. He had been standing guard for nearly 4 hours, and his stomach was cramping with hunger. The army had provided him with a meal the previous evening, but nothing since then. The officers had told him and his fellow soldiers that they needed to maintain discipline and focus during their assignment, which apparently meant going without basic necessities. Carlos was from a small rural town 300 kilometers away. From São Paulo, he had joined the army 6 months ago. Partly out of patriotic duty and partly because his family needed the steady income that military service provided, this was his first assignment in a major city. And everything about the experience was overwhelming and intimidating. The bread that Maria had offered smelled incredible. Even from across the street, Carlos could see her through the bakery window, going about her daily work with the same kindness she had shown him. Several times throughout the afternoon, she glanced in his direction, clearly concerned about his welfare. Around 2 o'clock, Carlos's commanding officer, Sergeant Rivera, arrived for an inspection of the guard posts. Sergeant Rivera was a career military man with 20 years of experience and a reputation for strict adherence to regulations. He walked the street, checking on each soldier's posture, alertness, and compliance with orders. When Sergeant Rivera reached Carlos's position, he immediately noticed the wrapped bread and bottle of water sitting on the steps of the bakery. His expression darkened as he realized what had happened. He demanded to know who had left the items there and whether Carlos had interacted with any civilians during his duty. Carlos explained the situation honestly, describing Maria's offer and his refusal to accept the food while on duty. He emphasized that he had followed regulations and had not compromised his position or duties. However, Sergeant Rivera was not satisfied with this explanation. The sergeant viewed Maria's gesture as a potential security breach and a violation of the boundaries that were supposed to exist between military personnel and civilians during times of heightened alert. He saw her approach as inappropriate at best and potentially suspicious at worst. His training had taught him to be wary of any civilian contact that deviated from normal procedures. Sergeant Rivera ordered Carlos to dispose of the bread and water immediately and to report any further contact with the bakery owner. He also warned Carlos that accepting gifts from civilians could be interpreted as fraught with security risks and could lead to disciplinary action. The message was clear: maintain distance from the local population and focus solely on military duties. After Sergeant Rivera left, Carlos reluctantly threw away the bread and poured out the water, following his orders despite his hunger and thirst. However, he could not stop thinking about Maria's kindness and the waste of food that could have helped him get through the day. The incident left him feeling conflicted about the rigid military protocols he was required to follow. Maria witnessed this scene from her bakery window. Her heart broke as she watched Carlos dispose of the food she had offered with such care. She understood that he was following orders, but the waste and rejection of her simple act of kindness felt deeply painful. However, instead of being discouraged, Maria became more determined to find a way to help. That evening, after Carlos's shift ended and he was replaced by another soldier, Maria learned more about the military's presence in her neighborhood. She spoke with other shop owners and longtime residents who had observed the soldiers throughout the day. The picture that emerged was troubling. The soldiers were working 12-hour shifts, minimal breaks, and inadequate meals. They were young men, mostly from rural areas, who had been assigned to urban patrol duty as part of the government's response to the ongoing protests. Many appeared exhausted, hungry, and homesick, struggling to maintain their composure while dealing with the stress of their assignment. Maria discovered that there were 6 soldiers rotating through guard duties on her street, working in pairs. With overlapping shifts, they were staying in a temporary military facility several kilometers away, where conditions were reportedly crowded and uncomfortable. The soldiers were receiving basic military rations, but the food was insufficient. For the physical demands of their assignment, the next morning, Carlos returned to his post across from Maria's bakery. He looked even more tired than the previous day, and Maria could see that he was struggling to maintain his alertness. The disposal of the bread and water the day before had clearly been difficult for him. His hunger was becoming more apparent. Maria made a decision that showed both courage and creativity. Instead of directly offering food to Carlos again, she would try a different approach. She began placing fresh bread and pastries in her bakery window in clear view of the soldier's position. The display was more elaborate than usual, designed to be visible and appealing from across the street. Throughout the morning, Maria made sure that the window display remained fresh and enticing. She positioned the bread so that the steam from newly baked loaves would carry across the street, filling the air with irresistible aromas. Her plan was to remind Carlos that food was available without directly violating the military protocols. That prevented him from accepting it. The strategy had its intended effect. Carlos found himself constantly aware of the bakery and its offerings. The smell of fresh bread made his hunger more acute, but it also provided a small comfort in an otherwise challenging situation. He began to appreciate Maria's subtle kindness and her understanding of his difficult position. Other neighbors began to notice Maria's enhanced window display and the obvious connection to the soldiers on guard duty. Some customers commented on her generosity and expressed sympathy for the young men who were clearly struggling with their assignment. Others worried that any interaction with the military might bring unwanted attention to the neighborhood. Around midday, something unexpected happened that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. A group of local teenagers, inspired by Maria's example, decided to take their own action to help the soldiers. Without consulting anyone, they began approaching the guards with offers of food, water, and small gifts. The teenagers' direct approach immediately created problems. The soldiers were forced to refuse the offerings more firmly. Some of the interactions became tense as the young people pressed their case. The situation escalated when one teenager accused a soldier of being heartless for refusing a simple sandwich. Sergeant Rivera arrived on the scene within minutes, having been alerted by radio to the disturbance. He was furious to discover multiple civilians attempting to interact with his soldiers and immediately implemented stricter protocols. He established a larger perimeter around the guard posts and warned all soldiers that any interaction with civilians would result in immediate disciplinary action. The sergeant also decided to address what he saw as the source of the problem. He marched directly to Maria's bakery, pushed open the door, and confronted her about her role in encouraging civilian contact with military personnel. His tone was harsh and accusatory as he demanded that she stop what he called interference with military operations. Maria stood behind her bakery counter as Sergeant Rivera towered over her, his voice growing louder with each accusation. She remained calm despite his aggressive tone, her hands folded quietly in front of her while he explained the serious nature of military security protocols. Other customers in the bakery stopped their conversations and watched the imminent confrontation with growing concern. Sergeant Rivera accused Maria of deliberately undermining military discipline and creating security risks through her actions, he claimed. That her gesture of offering bread had encouraged other civilians to approach the soldiers, creating distractions that could compromise their effectiveness. He demanded that she cease all contact with military personnel and remove the elaborate bread display from her window. Maria listened respectfully to the sergeant's concerns, but when he finished speaking, she responded with quiet dignity that surprised everyone present. She explained that she had offered food to a hungry young man because her conscience would not allow her to do otherwise. She had no political motivations and no desire to interfere with military operations, only a simple human impulse to help someone in need. The bakery customers began to murmur their support for Maria, with several elderly women stepping forward to defend her actions. They pointed out that Maria had been feeding the neighborhood for 30 years and that her kindness extended to everyone, regardless of their circumstances. One customer mentioned that Maria regularly gave free bread to poor families and had never expected anything in return. Sergeant Rivera found himself in an uncomfortable position as the crowd of supporters grew. He had expected to intimidate a single civilian into compliance, but instead he was facing an entire community that viewed Maria as a beloved local figure. The customers spoke passionately about her character and her history of generosity, making it clear that they would not tolerate her being treated unfairly. A local priest, Father Miguel, who had been purchasing his daily bread when the confrontation began, stepped forward to mediate the situation. He acknowledged the sergeant's concerns about military protocol, while also defending Maria's right to show compassion to those in need. Father Miguel suggested that there might be a way to address both the military's security requirements and Maria's desire to help. The priest proposed that instead of individual civilians approaching the soldiers, the community could work through official channels to provide support. He offered to contact the military command to discuss ways that local residents could show appreciation for the soldiers' service without compromising security protocols. This suggestion seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. However, Sergeant Rivera remained firm in his position that all civilian contact with his soldiers must cease immediately. He warned Maria that any further attempts to offer food or water to military personnel would be reported to higher authorities as interference with military operations. He left the bakery with a final warning that the situation was being monitored and documented. After the sergeant departed, the bakery erupted in animated conversation as customers expressed their outrage at his treatment of Maria. Many people offered to help if she faced any official repercussions for her kindness. The incident had clearly struck a nerve in the community, transforming what had been a simple act of compassion into a symbol of resistance against impersonal authority. That afternoon, word of the confrontation spread throughout the neighborhood faster than Maria could have imagined. The story grew with each telling, becoming a tale of an elderly bakery owner standing up to military intimidation while trying to help a hungry soldier. By evening, people from other parts of the city had heard about the incident and were coming to the bakery to show their support. Maria was overwhelmed by the attention and somewhat uncomfortable with being cast as a political figure. She repeatedly emphasized that her actions had been motivated purely by compassion, not by any desire to make a political statement. However, she gradually began to understand that in times of social tension, even simple acts of kindness could take on larger significance. The next morning brought an unexpected development that no one could have anticipated. Carlos arrived for his guard duty to find that overnight, someone had painted a mural on the wall next to Maria's bakery. The artwork depicted a woman offering bread to a young soldier, clearly inspired by the previous day's events. It was simple but powerful, showing the humanity that could exist even in tense circumstances. The mural attracted immediate attention from passers-by, many of whom stopped to photograph it and discuss its meaning. Some people left flowers at the base of the wall, while others placed small offerings of food and water near the artwork. The wall had become an impromptu shrine to compassion and human connection. Sergeant Rivera arrived at the scene within an hour of the mural's discovery, furious at what he saw as an escalation of the situation. He immediately called for city officials to remove the artwork, claiming that it represented unauthorized political expression and a continuing security threat. However, the city's response was not what he expected. The mayor's office, aware of the growing public interest in the story, decided to handle the situation carefully. Instead of immediately ordering the mural's removal, they announced that they would review the artwork to determine whether it violated any city ordinances. This decision effectively bought time while officials assessed the political implications of the incident. Meanwhile, local media outlets began covering the story of Maria's confrontation with the military. Reporters interviewed neighborhood residents, customers, and local officials about the incident and its broader implications. The story resonated with people who saw it as an example of ordinary citizens being caught between military authority and their own moral convictions. The media attention brought new supporters to Maria's Bakery, but it also attracted criticism from those who believed that civilians should not interfere with military operations during times of civil unrest. Online discussions about the incident became heated, with people taking strong positions on both sides of the issue. Carlos found himself at the center of unwanted attention as people tried to identify the soldier who had been offered bread by Maria. Some supporters wanted to help him directly, while others criticized him for following orders that required him to refuse food from a kind neighbor. The young soldier struggled with the conflicting emotions of gratitude toward Maria and loyalty to his military duties. 3 days after the initial incident, the situation took another dramatic turn when a government official arrived unannounced at Maria's Bakery. The man introduced himself as Colonel Eduardo Santana from the Regional Military Command, and his presence immediately drew a crowd of curious onlookers who recognized the significance of such a high-ranking officer visiting the small neighborhood bakery. Colonel Santana's demeanor was completely different from Sergeant Rivera's aggressive approach. He was polite and respectful as he asked Maria to explain her perspective on the recent events. He listened carefully to her account and asked thoughtful questions about her motivations and her relationship with the community she served. The colonel also spoke with several neighborhood residents, gathering their impressions of the situation and their views on the relationship between military personnel and civilians. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding the community's perspective rather than simply enforcing military protocols. After spending over an hour in the neighborhood, Colonel Santana made an announcement that shocked everyone present. He declared that the military command had reviewed the incident and concluded that Maria's actions represented the best traditions of civilian support for military personnel. Rather than punishment, she deserved recognition for her compassion and civic spirit. Colonel Santana's announcement sent shockwaves through the gathered crowd and fundamentally changed the trajectory of the entire situation. He explained that after reviewing the incident reports and conducting his own investigation, the military command had reached a very different conclusion than Sergeant Rivera's initial assessment. The colonel stated that Maria's gesture represented exactly the kind of civilian support that the military valued and needed. The colonel revealed that the military leadership had been concerned about the low morale and difficult conditions faced by soldiers assigned to urban patrol duties. Many young soldiers were struggling with homesickness, inadequate nutrition, and the stress of operating in unfamiliar urban environments. Maria's simple offer of bread had highlighted these problems and prompted a broader review of soldier welfare. Colonel Santana announced that the military would be implementing new policies to address the issues that Maria's kindness had brought to light. Soldiers would receive improved meal provisions, more frequent breaks, and better communication with their families. Additionally, the military would establish formal channels for community members to show support for troops without compromising security protocols. The colonel also revealed that Sergeant Rivera had been reassigned pending a review of his handling of the situation. The military command felt that his aggressive response to Maria's gesture of kindness had been inappropriate and had unnecessarily escalated tensions between military personnel and the civilian population they were supposed to protect. To everyone's amazement, Colonel Santana then made an unprecedented request. He asked Maria if she would be willing to help the military establish a pilot program for community military cooperation. The program would allow local businesses and residents to provide support for soldiers in appropriate and secure ways, with Maria's Bakery serving as a model for how such cooperation could work. Maria was initially overwhelmed by the colonel's proposal. She had never imagined that her simple act of offering bread to a hungry soldier would lead to such far-reaching consequences. However, after careful consideration and consultation with Father Miguel and other community leaders, she agreed to participate in the pilot program. The new program established specific times when soldiers could visit local businesses during their breaks, allowing them to purchase food and interact with civilians in controlled circumstances. Maria's bakery was designated as one of the approved locations, and she was given guidelines for how to provide support without compromising military security. Carlos was among the first soldiers to benefit from the new program. At Maria's bakery for his first official visit, the emotional reunion moved everyone present to tears. Maria finally had the opportunity to properly feed the young man she had wanted to help. Carlos was able to express his gratitude for her kindness and persistence. During their conversation, Carlos shared his background and the challenges he had faced during his military service, told Maria about his family's farm, his decision to join the army, and his homesickness while serving far from home. Maria listened with the same maternal attention she had once given to her own children, and their conversation helped both of them understand the human dimensions of their initial encounter. The bakery became a regular stop for soldiers during their breaks, and Maria developed personal relationships with many of them. She learned their names, their hometowns, and their individual stories. The soldiers, in turn, began to see the civilian population not as potential threats, but as supportive community members who appreciated their service. The success of the pilot program attracted attention from military commands in other cities, who were dealing with similar challenges in civilian-military relations. Delegations of officers visited Maria's neighborhood to observe the program and learn how it could be replicated elsewhere. Maria found herself serving as an unofficial consultant on community relations, sharing her insights about treating soldiers as human beings rather than just uniformed personnel. The media coverage of the program's success brought international attention to the story. Journalists from other countries visited the bakery to interview Maria and document how a simple gesture of kindness had transformed military-civilian relations in an entire district. The story became a symbol of how compassion could bridge divides and create positive change even in tense circumstances. However, success also brought new challenges. The constant attention and stream of visitors began to disrupt Maria's normal business operations. Tour groups and curiosity seekers crowded her small bakery, making it difficult for regular customers to shop comfortably. Maria struggled to balance her newfound role as a public figure with her primary identity as a neighborhood baker. Some members of the community began to worry that the tension might change Maria or alter the character of their neighborhood. They had always valued the quiet, authentic nature of their local bakery, and the constant media presence threatened to turn it into a tourist attraction rather than a genuine community gathering place. Maria herself grappled with the unexpected responsibilities that came with her new status. Government officials regularly sought her input on military policies, social programs, and community relations initiatives. While she was flattered by the attention, she sometimes felt overwhelmed by expectations that went far beyond her expertise. As a baker, the pressure intensified when political activists from various groups tried to recruit Maria to support their causes. Some wanted her to speak out against military presence in civilian areas, while others wanted her to endorse government policies. Maria consistently refused to take political positions, maintaining that her actions had been motivated purely by human compassion rather than political ideology. 3 months after the initial incident, Maria faced a decision that would test her commitment to her principles. A national political party approached her with an offer to run for local office, arguing that her story demonstrated the kind of leadership the community needed. The offer included financial support, media assistance, and the opportunity to influence policy on a much larger scale. The political offer forced Maria to reflect deeply on what had happened and what she wanted her legacy to be. She spent long hours talking with Father Miguel, her regular customers, and the soldiers who had become part of her extended community. She needed to decide whether to embrace a larger public role or return to the simple life of service that had always defined her. The decision was complicated by the fact that many people now depended on the program she had helped create. The Improved conditions for soldiers had made a real difference in their lives and effectiveness. The community cooperation model was being studied and implemented in other cities. Maria's withdrawal from public involvement might undermine these positive developments. On the other hand, Maria recognized that her greatest strength had always been her authentic connection to her community and her simple, direct way of helping people in need. The political arena might require compromises and calculations that could damage the very qualities that had made her effective as a catalyst for positive change as she considered her options. Maria realized that the young soldier, Carlos, had become a symbol of something larger than their individual encounter. He represented all the young people who were struggling to serve their country, while maintaining their humanity and connection to the communities they protected. Her response to his need had demonstrated that ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences through simple acts of conscience and courage. Maria made her decision on a quiet Sunday morning while preparing dough for the week ahead. She would decline the political offer and return her focus to the bakery and community that had always been her true calling. However, she would continue to support the military-civilian cooperation program as long as it benefited both the soldiers and the neighborhood. When Maria announced her decision to refuse the political position, the response was mixed. Some supporters were disappointed, believing she could have made an even greater impact in elected office. Others praised her for staying true to her roots and maintaining the authenticity that had made her story so powerful in the first place. The political party that had courted Maria was not pleased with her decision. They had invested considerable time and resources in developing their proposal, and they had expected that her desire to help people would translate into political ambition. Some party officials suggested that Maria was being naive about the realities of creating systematic change. However, Maria's decision proved to be wise as the program she had helped establish continued to evolve and expand. The military command designated her neighborhood as a permanent model site for civilian military cooperation. Ensuring that the positive changes would continue beyond any individual assignments or personnel changes, Carlos Fute completed his urban patrol assignment and was preparing to return to his home region. It's played a crucial role in documenting the program's success. He had been asked to write a detailed report about his experiences, which would be used to train other soldiers and inform policy decisions. His account emphasized how Maria's kindness had transformed his understanding of his role as a soldier and his relationship with civilian communities. In his report, Carlos described how the program had improved not only soldier morale and nutrition, but also the effectiveness of military operations. Soldiers who felt supported by their communities were more alert, more cooperative with civilian authorities, and more committed to protecting the people they served. The pilot program had demonstrated that security and compassion were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of effective governance. The success metrics were impressive. Incidents of tension between soldiers and civilians had decreased by over 70% in Maria's district. Soldiers' sick leave and disciplinary actions had dropped significantly. Community cooperation with security operations had increased, leading to better information sharing and more effective crime prevention. The program was achieving its goals while maintaining military discipline and security protocols. Based on these results, the military command decided to expand the program to 12 other urban districts across the country. Maria was invited to help train business owners and community leaders in other cities. Sharing her insights about building trust and mutual support between military personnel and civilians, Maria agreed to participate in the training program, but only on a limited basis that would not require her to leave her bakery for extended periods. She developed simple guidelines that emphasized treating soldiers as individual human beings rather than abstract security forces. Her advice focused on small gestures of recognition and support that could make significant differences in morale. In community relations, the training sessions were held in Maria's bakery whenever possible, allowing participants to observe the program in action. Military officers and civilian leaders from other cities would spend days in the neighborhood, watching how the cooperation model worked in practice and speaking with both soldiers and residents about their experiences. One training session brought unexpected challenges when participants from different cities disagreed about how the program should be implemented. Some military officers wanted stricter security controls, while some civilian leaders pushed for more extensive interaction opportunities. Maria found herself mediating these discussions, drawing on her practical experience to find balanced solutions. The disagreements highlighted the complexity of replicating the program in different contexts. What worked in Maria's established neighborhood might not be appropriate in areas with different demographics, economic conditions, or security concerns. Each implementation would need to be adapted to local circumstances while maintaining the core principles of mutual respect and human dignity. During one particularly difficult training session, a military officer questioned whether the program was worth the administrative complexity and potential security risks it created. He argued that traditional military-civilian separation was more efficient and predictable than the cooperative approach Maria advocated. Maria's response to this challenge became legendary among program participants. She invited the skeptical officer to spend a day working alongside Carlos, who had returned specifically to help with the training session. The officer was tasked with standing guard duty for 4 hours without food, water, or meaningful human interaction, exactly as soldiers had done before the program began. By the end of his shift, the officer was exhausted, dehydrated, and frustrated. He gained first-hand understanding of the conditions that soldiers faced and the impact that small gestures of support could have on their effectiveness and well-being. His experience became a powerful teaching tool that convinced other skeptics of the program's value. The training program also revealed the broader implications of Maria's initial gesture. Military analysts determined that improved soldier welfare through community support could reduce training costs, decrease personnel turnover, and enhance national security. The economic benefits of the program extended far beyond the immediate costs of implementation. However, the expansion of the program also brought new responsibilities that sometimes overwhelmed. She received dozens of requests for consultation, speaking engagements, and media interviews. Government officials sought her input on policies ranging from military housing to veteran services. International organizations invited her to conferences on conflict resolution and community building. Maria struggled to balance these demands with her commitment to maintaining the bakery and serving her immediate community. She began to worry that her growing reputation might distance her from the simple, direct relationships that had always been the source of her effectiveness. The challenge was to remain accessible to her neighbors, while also sharing her insights with a broader audience. The solution came from an unexpected source: the soldiers themselves. Carlos and several other veterans of the program volunteered to help Maria manage her external commitments. They established a support network that handled scheduling, correspondence, and logistics, allowing Maria to focus on the substantive work of building understanding between military and civilian communities. This veteran support network became another innovative aspect of the program. Former soldiers who had benefited from community support during their service became advocates and facilitators for expanding that support to others. They could speak credibly to both military and civilian audiences about the program's benefits. In challenges 6 months after declining the political position, Maria reflected on how much her life had changed since that first morning when she offered bread to a hungry soldier. Her simple act of compassion had grown into a movement that was transforming military-civilian relations across the country. Yet the core of her identity remained unchanged. She was still a baker who believed in feeding people and building community, one relationship at a time. The mural that had appeared on the wall beside her bakery had become a pilgrimage site for people interested in the story. Visitors from around the world came to see where the program had begun and to meet the woman whose kindness had started it all. Maria welcomed these visitors warmly, but always reminded them that the real significance of the story lay not in her individual actions, but in the community's collective commitment to treating all people with dignity and compassion. 2 years after Maria first offered bread to Carlos, Ilalasa, the program they had inadvertently created, was operating in 43 cities across Brazil and had inspired similar initiatives in 6 other countries. The success had exceeded everyone's expectations. But it had also created new challenges that neither Maria nor the military command had anticipated. The international attention brought delegations of officials from governments around the world who wanted to study the program and adapt it to their own contexts. Military leaders from countries dealing with civil unrest, peacekeeping operations, and community relations issues all sought to understand how a simple gesture of kindness had evolved into a systematic approach to improving security through human connection. Maria found herself hosting visitors from places she had never imagined she would encounter: generals from African nations, peace negotiators from conflict zones in the Middle East, and community organizers from urban areas in Europe and North America. Each group brought their own challenges and perspectives, requiring Maria to articulate principles that she had previously understood only intuitively. These international exchanges taught Maria that the fundamental human needs she had recognized in Carlos were universal. Soldiers everywhere struggled with separation from home, inadequate support systems, and the dehumanizing effects of military bureaucracy. Communities everywhere yearned for security forces who saw them as people worth protecting rather than potential threats to be controlled. However, implementing the program in different cultural and political contexts proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. What worked in Maria's Brazilian neighborhood could not be directly transplanted to war zones, authoritarian societies, or communities with deep historical mistrust of military forces. Each adaptation required careful consideration of local customs, security concerns, and political realities. Maria learned to emphasize the underlying principles rather than specific procedures when advising international visitors. She stressed the importance of seeing individuals behind uniforms, creating opportunities for genuine human connection, and building trust through consistent small acts of kindness and respect. The details of implementation needed to be developed locally, but the core values were universal. The most challenging adaptation came when representatives from a country experiencing civil war visited Maria's bakery. They were desperate to find ways to reduce hostility between government forces and civilian populations, but their situation involved active combat, deep ethnic divisions, and decades of accumulated grievances. Maria realized that her model might be inadequate for such extreme circumstances. Working with international peace organizations, Maria helped develop modified approaches for conflict zones. These adaptations focused on neutral spaces, carefully structured interactions, and gradual, trust-building measures that could survive in environments where security remained a primary concern. The programs moved more slowly and required more safeguards, but they still demonstrated the power of human connection to reduce tensions. Meanwhile, back in her own neighborhood, Maria faced personal challenges that tested her commitment to the work she had accidentally started. Her health began to decline as the stress of constant attention and travel took its toll. At 64, she was no longer able to maintain the demanding schedule of baking, hosting visitors, and consulting. On program development, the community rallied around Maria, just as she had once rallied around Carlos. Neighbors volunteered to help with bakery operations, handle correspondence, and manage the stream of visitors. Regular customers formed a protective circle that ensured Maria could rest when needed while still maintaining her connection to the work that had become her legacy. Carlos, who had completed his military service and returned to his hometown, made a decision that surprised everyone. He enrolled in university to study social work and conflict resolution, inspired by his experiences with Maria's program. His goal was to become a professional advocate for military-civilian cooperation, carrying forward the lessons he had learned. From a simple offer of bread during his studies, Carlos conducted research on the long-term impacts of the program, interviewing soldiers, community members, and officials from multiple cities. His findings confirmed what Maria had always believed: treating people with dignity and compassion was not just morally right but also practically effective for achieving security and social stability. Carlos's research also revealed unintended benefits of the program that had not been anticipated by its creators. Communities that participated in military-civilian cooperation showed higher levels of civic engagement, reduced crime rates, and improved social cohesion. The program had strengthened democracy by building bridges between institutions and citizens. Third anniversary of Maria's initial gesture was marked by a ceremony that brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the program. Soldiers, community leaders, government officials, and international visitors gathered in the street where it all began. The mural on the bakery wall had been restored and expanded to include scenes from program sites around the world. During the ceremony, Maria was presented with numerous awards and honors from various organizations and governments. However, the recognition that meant the most to her came from the soldiers themselves. A group of veterans from the original program presented her with a simple plaque that read, "To Maria Santos, who taught us that bread shared with love can change the world." In her speech at the ceremony, Maria reflected on the journey that had begun with her concern for a hungry young soldier. She emphasized that the program's success demonstrated the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change through simple acts of conscience and courage. She reminded the audience that everyone had the ability to see past uniforms, titles, and roles to recognize the shared humanity that connected all people. Maria also acknowledged the challenges that remained. Despite the program's success, military-civilian tensions persisted in many parts of the world. Poverty, inequality, and political conflict continued to create conditions where security forces and civilian populations viewed each other with suspicion and fear. The work of building understanding and trust was never finished and required constant attention and commitment. As Maria looked out at the crowd gathered to celebrate the anniversary, she saw faces that represented the global community that had grown from her local act of kindness. She saw former soldiers who had become advocates for peace, community leaders who had learned to work with security forces, and young people who were inspired to build bridges across divides. The bakery continued to operate as both a neighborhood institution and a symbol of hope for people around the world. Maria still arrived before dawn to bake fresh bread. Though she now had help from volunteers who had learned her recipes and techniques, the smell of baking bread still filled the street each morning, reminding everyone who passed that simple acts of nourishment and care could transform communities and touch lives far beyond their original intention. The story that began with one woman offering bread to one guard had become a testament to the power of individual conscience to create systematic change. Maria Santos had proven that ordinary citizens could influence military policies, improve security practices, and build more compassionate societies, simply by treating others with the dignity and respect that every human being deserved. Her legacy lived on in programs around the world where communities and security forces were learning to see each other as partners in building safer, more just societies.